The last survivor. I was on the Titanic. I have kept this secret for a very long time. Not because I was ashamed, not because I wanted to forget, but because every single time I tried to tell it, every time I sat down and opened my mouth and let my mind go back to that night, something inside me just closed, like a door shutting against a storm. The memories were too big, too cold, too loud to let out all at once without losing something of myself in the process. But I am 103 years old. I don't have the luxury of waiting anymore. My name is Elias Whitmore. I was born in the spring of 1909 in a small town in Hampshire, England, to a father who worked the docks and a mother who made the best rabbit stew in the county. I was 3 years old when I boarded the RMS Titanic with my mother and my aunt in April of 1912. 3 years old, too young to understand what was happening, too young to carry conscious memories in the way an adult would. But here is what I've come to believe in a century of living. The body remembers what the mind cannot hold. The cold remembers, the fear remembers, and some things, my friends, get pressed into you so deeply that even 100 years cannot wash them out. So yes, I was there. I was on that ship. And tonight I'm going to tell you everything. Let me take you back to Southampton, England, April 10th, 1912. I need you to understand what this day felt like, not just for us, but for the entire world, because the Titanic wasn't simply a ship. You have to understand that. It was a statement. It was humanity standing up straight and puffing out its chest and saying, "Look what we have built. Look how far we have come. Look at what our hands and our minds and our ambition have created." The White Star Line had built something that the newspapers called, without a trace of embarrassment, the greatest moving object ever made by human hands. And when you stood on the docks at Southampton that April morning and looked up at her, truly looked up at her, you understood why they said it. She was 882 feet long, nearly 900 feet. She was 11 stories tall, from keel to funnel top. She weighed 46,000 tons. Her 4 smokestacks were each large enough to drive 2 trains side by side through them. I know these numbers now, of course. At 3 years old, I knew none of them. But I remember, or perhaps I remember being told that I remember, my mother lifting me up in her arms as we stood on the dock, and the sheer size of that hull filling my entire vision. Not just big, impossibly big, the kind of big that doesn't make sense to a child's eyes, the kind that makes you feel like you've stumbled into a world built for giants. "Look, Elias," my mother said, "isn't she beautiful?" She was. God help us, she was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. My mother's name was Catherine. She was 26 years old, beautiful, dark-haired, quick to laugh. Her sister, my Aunt Vera, was travelling with us. We were third-class passengers, steerage, which meant our accommodations were at the bottom of the ship, and our tickets had cost just a few pounds. But even third class on the Titanic was better than what most of us were used to. My mother kept saying that over and over in those first hours aboard. Better than home, Elias, better than home. And she was right. The third-class cabins were small but clean. Actual beds, not hammocks or straw pallets, but proper bunks with white linens. A wash basin with running water. My mother touched that faucet like it was made of gold. She turned it on and off several times just to feel the novelty of it. Where we came from, running water was a luxury. But while our world was down in the lower decks above us in first class, there was a world that most of us could barely imagine even existed. I've read about it since in books and documents and survivor accounts. First class on the Titanic was not simply comfortable, it was, and I am not exaggerating, among the most luxurious environments ever created in the history of human civilization up to that point. There was a swimming pool aboard that ship, an actual swimming pool on a moving vessel in the middle of the ocean. There was a squash court, a Turkish bath, a gymnasium with the latest mechanical exercise equipment. There was a first-class restaurant that had been modelled after the great dining rooms of London and Paris, with actual à la carte service, white tablecloths, silver candlesticks, and a menu that ran to multiple courses. The grand staircase, I have seen photographs of it, and it takes your breath away, even in black and white. A sweeping double staircase beneath an ornate glass dome with wrought iron banisters and carved oak panels and a clock on the landing, flanked by two bronze figures. Millionaires and socialites descended those stairs every evening for dinner, dressed in the finest clothes that money could buy. John Jacob Astor IV was aboard, one of the richest men in America, worth in today's money something like $90 billion. He and his new young wife Madeline had just returned from an extended European honeymoon. The Countess of Rothes was aboard, Benjamin Guggenheim of the famous Guggenheim family, Isidor Straus, who co-owned Macy's department store, and his wife Ida. Margaret Brown, whom history would come to call the unsinkable Molly Brown. Thomas Andrews himself, the ship's designer, was aboard, travelling to observe how his creation performed on her maiden voyage. And Captain Edward John Smith, 62 years old, silver-haired, with a beard that made him look like a portrait of authority itself, was at the helm of his last command before retirement. This was to be his farewell voyage. 40 years at sea, ending with the grandest ship ever built. Everyone was where they were supposed to be. The greatest ship in the world, crewed by the best men in the business, carrying some of the most important people alive. Sailing on a flat, calm sea, under a sky so full of stars it looked like a painting. What could possibly go wrong? Those first 2 days at sea were like a dream. Even in third class, the mood was festive, almost giddy. People had come from all over Europe, Irish families, Swedish immigrants, Lebanese merchants, English working-class families like ours, all heading to America with their bags packed and their hearts full of hope. America, the new world, the land of possibility, the place where a man could build something from nothing if he worked hard enough and kept his chin up. The conversations in the third-class common room crackled with that energy. Men trading stories about cousins who had made good in New York or Boston or Chicago. Women comparing notes on what they'd packed, what they'd left behind. Children running up and down the corridors playing chase, their feet thundering on the metal floors, their laughter bouncing off the walls. My mother danced on the second night. Someone had brought a fiddle, and someone else had a tin whistle, and in that warm, crowded, low-ceilinged common room, 100 people who had never met each other before stamped their feet and clapped their hands and swung each other around. I remember being passed from lap to lap as the music played, or perhaps I remember being told of it. Warm arms and laughing faces, and the smell of tobacco and sea air and wool. There was joy on that ship, real, unguarded, human joy. And I want you to hold on to that image because I'm going to ask you to remember it later when the joy is gone and there is nothing left but cold and dark and silence. Up above us, in the great dining rooms of first class, the wealthy passengers were enjoying meals of 10 and 12 courses, drinking the finest wines, smoking the finest cigars. They were discussing business and politics and society gossip with the easy confidence of people who have never had reason to doubt that the world was arranged for their comfort. The orchestra played every evening. The Titanic carried 8 musicians, a quintet and a trio who sometimes combined into a full ensemble, and they played in the first-class reception room before and after dinner. Light, elegant music, ragtime and hymns and popular songs of the day. The kind of music that fills a room and makes everyone in it feel that the world is exactly as it should be. Nobody was worried. Nobody had any reason to be. On Sunday, April 14th, the fourth day at sea, the weather was beautiful but cold, the kind of crisp, clear, brilliant cold that makes everything look sharp and clean. The Atlantic was extraordinarily calm that evening, unusual for that time of year. The water was so still it looked almost like glass. Some of the sailors would later say that the very calmness was part of the problem, that in rougher water, waves breaking against an iceberg would create white foam that made it visible at a distance. But that night the sea was a mirror, and the night was moonless, and the icebergs rising black and silent out of the black water were all but invisible until you were almost on top of them. The Titanic had received ice warnings throughout the day, several from other ships in the area who had spotted ice fields and icebergs ahead. The warnings were received and noted, and then, for reasons that historians and investigators have debated for over a century, the ship maintained her speed, 22 knots, nearly full speed, through the ice-field waters in the dark of a moonless night. I have no interest in assigning blame in my old age. The captain, the officers, the directors of the White Star Line, they all made decisions that night that seem, in retrospect, almost unbelievable. But I think about the confidence, the pride, the absolute, unshakable confidence that human ingenuity had built something that the ocean itself could not defeat. She was unsinkable. Everyone knew it. The newspapers had said so. The designers had said so. The numbers said so. 16 watertight compartments, any 4 of which could be flooded without sinking the ship. She was not just a ship. She was a proof that we had conquered nature, that we had won pride, that old, familiar, fatal human pride. It was 11:40 in the evening when the lookouts in the crow's nest spotted it. Frederick Fleet, 24 years old, stationed up in that cold metal basket at the top of the forward mast, staring into the black night, saw something, a darker shape against the dark horizon. His heart understood what his mind was still calculating, and he grabbed the telephone and rang the bridge. "Iceberg, right ahead." Those 3 words. The officer on watch ordered the helm hard to starboard and the engines reversed, and the Titanic, 882 feet of steel and iron, 46,000 tons, moving at 22 knots, began to turn. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the way a mountain turns. She almost made it. That is the cruelest part. She almost missed it. But the iceberg caught her along the starboard side, below the waterline. Not a direct collision, but a long, scraping, grinding blow that ran along nearly 300 feet of her hull. It would have looked almost gentle from above. It would have looked almost like nothing at all. Below the waterline, it opened her like a letter. I was 3 years old, and I was asleep in my mother's arms in our third-class cabin when it happened. What I know of the moment itself, I know from the accounts of hundreds of other survivors, pored over in the decades since. But this is what they described, and this is what I ask you to imagine. A sound, not a crash, not the explosive collision you might imagine when you hear the word iceberg. More like a long, low grinding, a shudder, like the whole ship had run her hull across a gravel road. Some passengers hardly noticed it. Some thought they'd imagined it. In the first-class smoking room, men playing cards looked up briefly and then returned to their hands. In the lower decks, closer to the waterline, they felt it differently. A harder shudder, a sound like a giant hand dragging its knuckles along a metal wall. And then, a few seconds later, silence. The engines had stopped. That deep, constant vibration that you stop noticing after the first hour at sea. Suddenly it was gone. And in its absence, there was a stillness that felt wrong. My mother woke up. She would tell me later. or this is the story I grew up with, told so many times it became woven into the fabric of my memory, that she woke up before anything happened. That she woke up not because of the collision, but because of some instinct, some deep animal awareness that something had shifted in the world. She lay still for a moment, listening, holding me. And then she noticed that the engines had stopped. She got up. She dressed herself and dressed me, and she went to find my Aunt Vera. And that decision, that simple, cautious, inexplicable decision to get up and get dressed rather than go back to sleep, is the reason I am sitting here talking to you today. For the first half hour, nobody told the third-class passengers anything. The first-class and second-class passengers were informed relatively quickly that something had happened, that they should come up on deck, that they should bring their lifebelts. But down in steerage, in the bottom of the ship, the information arrived slowly and in fragments. A steward knocking on doors saying there'd been a small incident, nothing to worry about, but put your lifebelts on just in case. Another steward saying the same thing with slightly wider eyes than the words suggested. Then the sound of people moving in the corridor. Then the feeling of the floor tilting, very slightly, almost imperceptibly at first, toward the bow. My mother understood before anyone told her. I believe that. She was a dock worker's daughter. She'd grown up around ships. She felt that tilt, and she picked me up and she grabbed Aunt Vera's hand and she said, and I know these words as well as I know my own name because Vera told me them 1,000 times over the years. We're getting off this ship. Right now, do not stop moving. But getting off was not as simple as it sounds. The Titanic had been designed, and this is a fact so horrifying I want you to really hear it, with lifeboats for only about half the people aboard. There were more than 2,200 people on that ship. There were lifeboats for approximately 1,100, 16 wooden lifeboats and 4 collapsible boats, that was it. And many of those boats were launched only partially full because in the first hour after the collision, many passengers genuinely did not believe the ship was going to sink, and they stood at the rail in their dressing gowns watching the lifeboats being lowered and declining to get in them. I want you to let that breathe for a moment. The lifeboats left the ship with empty seats while people who needed those seats drowned because nobody believed it was real. The navigation through the ship's corridors was its own catastrophe for those of us in third class. Some of the gates that separated steerage from the upper decks were locked. The exact reasons for this have been argued over for decades. Some say it was to prevent third-class passengers from overwhelming the boat deck. Some say it was standard practice to prevent immigrants from mixing with the wealthier passengers. Some say it was simply confusion and miscommunication in a crisis. Whatever the reason, families stood at locked gates while the water rose around their feet. Some crew members unlocked the gates. Some broke them open themselves when no one came. Some third-class passengers found their own ways up, through kitchens and service corridors and maintenance passages, following any route that led upward. My mother, with her dock worker's instincts and her iron will and her total refusal to accept that there was no way out, found a passage. I will never know exactly how she did it. Vera and I were never able to fully reconstruct the route after the fact. But she found a way up and through and onto the boat deck, and she pushed through the crowd to the side of the ship where a lifeboat 16, I have always believed, though the records aren't perfectly clear, was being loaded. A sailor was managing the loading. "Women and children," he was shouting. "Women and children only." My mother pushed to the front. She handed me over the railing to a man already in the boat. Then she climbed in herself and reached back for Vera, and Vera grabbed her hand. And Vera was told to wait. The boat was full. Lower away. The last thing my Aunt Vera saw as our lifeboat went down was my mother's face looking up at her from below, getting smaller and smaller in the darkness. I need to tell you what was happening on that ship in those final hours, because it matters. Because those people deserve to have their last hours witnessed and remembered, not swallowed by the dark water. By midnight, the captain knew the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, who had walked through the flooded compartments with a lamp and done the calculations in his head, knew she had perhaps 2 hours, maybe less. The band was still playing. They had set up on the boat deck, and they played as the lifeboats loaded and as the ship tilted, and as the night grew colder and the stars burned overhead with that terrible, beautiful indifference of stars. They played ragtime at first, popular songs, music, to keep people calm. Then in the final hour, witnesses reported they switched to hymns. Hymns played on a tilting deck as the water climbed the grand staircase, and the lights flickered, and 1,500 people understood they were going to die. I have read about the things people did in those last hours, and they have stayed with me my entire life. Isidor Strauss, the department store owner, was offered a place in a lifeboat. He refused to take a seat before any other man had been saved. His wife Ida was offered a seat, and she refused to leave her husband. She was reported to have said simply, "Where you go, I go." They sat down together on deck chairs. They held each other. And they went down with the ship, together, after 50 years of marriage. Benjamin Guggenheim and his valet, in the final hour, went to their cabins, changed into their formal evening attire, and came back up on deck. He reportedly said, "We've dressed in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." The musicians played until they could no longer stand on the slanting deck. The wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, stayed at their posts sending distress signals long after they had been relieved of duty and told to save themselves. Phillips stayed until nearly the end. He died in the water. He was 25 years old. The engineers, all 36 of them, stayed below decks, keeping the electrical systems running so that the ship's lights stayed on and the wireless kept working. Every single one of them died. Not one engineer survived. They stayed at their posts in the flooding engine room so that others might have a chance. Every one of them died. Say their names in your heart. They deserve it. In the lifeboat, my mother held me against her chest and rowed. She rowed because she had to do something, because sitting still and watching that ship was more than a human being could be asked to endure without action. And what she watched. At 2:20 in the morning, 2 hours and 40 minutes after the collision, the Titanic sank. But she did not sink gracefully. She broke. The stress on her hull as her bow went underwater and her stern rose into the air was too great, and she broke apart. The stern section snapping upward with a sound that the survivors in the lifeboats described as the most terrible thing they had ever heard. A roar and a crack, and the sound of everything inside, all the furniture and the crockery, and the boilers and the luggage and the engines, tearing loose and cascading forward in a waterfall of debris and chaos and human lives. And then she was gone. In less than 3 minutes from when she broke, she was gone. The greatest ship ever built slid beneath the surface of the North Atlantic, carrying with her more than 1,500 human souls. And in the darkness where she had been, the water was full of people. This is the part that the movies never fully capture. This is the part that I have never been able to describe adequately, no matter how many times I have tried over 100 years. The sound of 1,500 people in the water, in the dark, in the cold. The North Atlantic in April is approximately 28 degrees Fahrenheit, just below freezing, A human being fully submerged in water that cold loses muscle control. Within minutes, the heart can go into shock in less than 15 minutes. Most people in the water that night did not drown. They died of cardiac arrest brought on by cold water shock. And as they died, one by one, the sound changed. The screaming and the calling and the desperate human chorus slowly faded. And the silence that replaced it was the most terrible silence in the history of the world. My mother put her hands over my ears, but I do not think she could cover her own. The lifeboats mostly stayed where they were. I want you to understand what I mean when I say that. There were lifeboats in the water that were half full, boats that could have rowed back into the field of dying people and pulled dozens of them out of the water. Most of them did not go back. The people in the boats were afraid of being swamped by desperate survivors grabbing the sides. They were afraid that the weight would capsize them. They were afraid. Fear kept them from doing what they knew was right. One boat went back. Lifeboat 14, commanded by 5th Officer Harold Lowe, who had rallied 5 boats together, transferred passengers between them to make one boat as empty as possible, and then rowed back into the field of the dead and dying. He found 6 people still alive. 6 out of 1,500. Harold Lowe was 28 years old. He was the only officer who went back. History should say his name every single day. My Aunt Vera survived. I have not yet told you that, and I realize you needed to know. She was pulled into a collapsible boat, one of the canvas-sided emergency boats that was barely afloat, and she floated in the darkness for nearly 3 hours before the RMS Carpathia arrived to pull them out. When Vera was hauled up the rope ladder onto the Carpathia, she was so cold she could barely hold on. Her hands had stopped working. A crew member climbed down and tied a rope under her arms, and she was pulled up like cargo. She lay on the deck of the Carpathia, and she said she could hear people crying all around her. The Carpathia's passengers, ordinary people who had been asleep at sea and woken to this nightmare, were handing out blankets and hot drinks and coats off their own backs. When my mother found Vera on that deck, when they found each other among 700 survivors, Vera said my mother simply held her and couldn't let go. Neither of them could speak. They had no words for it. I don't think words exist. I have lived for over 100 years since that night. I have watched the world change beyond recognition. I have watched empires fall and nations rise and wars come and go, and the whole human story continue its strange, stumbling, beautiful, terrible progress. I have had a long, full life, more than I deserved perhaps, given how close it came to ending before it had properly started. And in all those years, not a single April 14th has passed without me stopping to remember. Not to mourn exactly, not anymore. The grief has softened over a century into something quieter and deeper than grief, more like reverence, a deep, permanent reverence for the people who didn't make it off that ship, for the lives that were never lived, for all the things those 1,500 people might have done and been and loved and created if the iceberg had moved a few feet to the left, or the ship had turned a few seconds sooner, or a single officer with a key had unlocked a gate on time. The Titanic has become, in the 100+ years since that night, a kind of universal symbol, a parable. And I've heard 100 different lessons drawn from it over my lifetime. Lessons about hubris and technology. Lessons about class and inequality. The first-class passengers had a survival rate of roughly 60%, second class about 40%, third class barely 25%. The numbers are damning. They were damning in 1912, and they remain damning today. The rich were saved at a rate more than twice that of the poor. On a sinking ship, as in much of life, where you started determined how far you got. I have heard lessons about the lifeboats, about maritime safety regulations, about the ice warnings that were ignored. All of these lessons are true, and all of them matter, but the lesson that sits deepest with me after all these years is simpler than any of that. 2,200 people got on a ship, and the ship was described as unsinkable. The newspapers said it, the company said it, the engineers said it, and everyone on board, from the wealthiest passenger in the finest suite to the poorest immigrant family in steerage, believed it. Because we wanted to believe it, because believing it felt wonderful, because human beings built that ship, and it felt like a glory, a triumph, a proof that we had finally gotten nature on a leash. And the ice didn't care, the ocean didn't care. Nature doesn't read our press releases or attend our celebrations or care one bit what we think about our own ingenuity. The moment you decide you are unsinkable is the moment you stop watching for icebergs. That is the lesson. That will always be the lesson, not just about ships, about everything. About marriages, you stop tending because you assume they're solid. About health, you stop protecting because you feel invincible. About democracies, you stop defending because you take them for granted. About peace, you stop working for because it seems permanent. About anything at all, that you love and depend upon and simply assume will always be there because it has always been there before. Nothing is unsinkable. Nothing that human beings build is beyond breaking. The only question is whether you're paying attention, whether you're watching the dark water, whether you have the humility to understand that what you have made, however magnificent, is still fragile, is still mortal, is still subject to the cold laws of the universe which owe us nothing. I was 3 years old on the Titanic, and I have been 103 years old for my entire life afterward, trying to understand why I got to live when so many others did not. I don't have an answer to that. I've stopped looking for one. Some questions don't have answers, and making peace with that is its own kind of wisdom. What I have instead of an answer is a responsibility, the responsibility of the survivor, the responsibility to remember, to speak, to make sure that the 1,500 voices that went silent in the dark water of the North Atlantic on the 15th of April 1912 are never forgotten, to make sure you know that they were real, that they laughed and danced and worried about money and loved their children and argued with their siblings and dreamed about what waited for them in America. They were real. Every single one of them was real. And we owe them our attention. We owe them the small daily act of remembering that this world is fragile and precious and not guaranteed. We owe them the humility to look out into the dark water and watch for what we cannot yet see. My mother lived to be 87 years old. My Aunt Vera lived to 91. They carried that night with them every day of their lives, and they built beautiful, stubborn, grateful lives in spite of it. Because of it, the way survivors do. I carry it too, right here, in the oldest part of me, in the place where the body keeps what the mind can't hold. The Titanic is on the ocean floor, 2.5 miles down, in the dark and the cold where no light reaches. She has been there for over a century. She is slowly dissolving. Iron-eating bacteria are consuming her, and scientists say she may disappear entirely within another few decades. The greatest ship ever built, returning grain by grain to the ocean that took her. But she is not forgotten. She will not be forgotten. Not while I have breath. Not, I hope, while you have memory. Remember her. Remember them. And watch the dark water.